I hope you're enjoying the story so far. Are you enjoying the story? Yeah, it's really great. My friend Randy Frazee had a big part of this and had a great experience. I wanted to talk with you a little bit, though, about Bishop Sherwood. Sherwood was a friend of mine. And, when things like this happen, you say to yourself, well, how could God allow this? How could God allow a man who's a pastor, who's involved in our community, who's made so much good, how could he allow this to happen? And while I don't have a specific answer for that, I do know this, that God is already at work in the midst of this pain. Thank you for praying for Boss, based out of South Sac. My friend Efren Smith is there this morning, preaching and teaching, encouraging them, and trying to bring light and life to that church family. So I just would ask that you continue to pray for our dear friends at Bayside. They're a sister church. And God's upper story, what God is accomplishing through the ages, gets worked out in our lower story. So we live our everyday walking around life, and God does His purposes intersecting and intertwining every day with the reality of our life. So look at the map over here. Today's story in chapter 4 of the story focuses on Moses coming from the land of Egypt, going to the desert of Sinai, and then essentially going back. And so today's story is kind of a back and forth, back and forth. He starts in the palace, goes out to the desert, ends up going back to the palace, leads the children of Israel out of the palace into the desert. You'll pick up the rest of the story later. They're on their way to the promised land. It's a great opportunity. I want to encourage you to take your teaching notes out. And we're going to learn about the story. But one of the things that I've discovered is that the story of the Bible, God's story of the upper story intersecting with the lower story, is almost always told through characters. For instance, last week you kind of focused on Joseph, right? Well, this week the focus is Moses. And Moses is one of those Bible characters. He's kind of a hero. And one of the things that I've discovered is that we tend to look at Bible heroes and look at them as if they were sort of otherworldly. Well, I'm on a quest to make Bible heroes be the real flesh and blood men and women that they are. So as we study Moses today, you're going to learn about the reality of his life, and I want to focus on one particular aspect. Moses was a Bible hero who on a regular basis said no to God. Moses said no to God time and time again. In fact, he regularly made excuses, reasons why he had to say no to God. Now, if you're a person who makes excuses, and if you've ever made an excuse in your life, just raise your hand. Have you ever made an excuse in your life? Okay, great. That's all of us. We've all made excuses. In fact, I was doing a little study of this, and I came across some excuses that were made by people in Indiana. Do we have any Hoosiers here today? Any Hoosiers? Okay, well, the state is known for good basketball players, but apparently their excuses when it comes to high school absences. This was a high school in Indiana. They're not as clever as they are good basketball players. So here's a couple excuses. First of all, I think they had help from their parents, by the way, on this. Please excuse Betsy for being absent. She was sick, and I had her shot. That's the first excuse. This is another one. Had to be a parent involved in this. Please excuse Michael for being absent on January 30th, 31st, 32nd, 33rd, and 34th because he was ailing. Okay, now, next one. My son is under a doctor's care and he should not take physical ed. Please execute him. That's a rough state. Kind of like being an SC football coach. You get shot. Okay, some of you know what I'm talking about. All right, now, the next one. This one I think we all can relate to. Please excuse Fred for being. It was his father's fault. And I think there's some truth there, okay? So anyway, we all make excuses. We all that. Take your teaching notes out. I'm going to talk a little bit about Moses' background. Before we get in the story, you see the M on the map. Who was Moses and what is his background? What do you need to know about his story? I'll give you 4 quick things. First of all, he had a background of privilege. Background of privilege. Now, quickly, if I say to you, do you feel like you know a fair amount about Moses? Would a lot of you raise your hands? You know about Moses? You heard the story? Okay. How many of you, I'm just curious, know about Moses from the animated feature film Prince of Egypt? How many have seen that? Okay. Amazing cart driver, right? He just absolutely has a thing with carts. He's able to do that. How many of you know, like I did from childhood, how many of you know the story of Moses from the 10 Commandments by Cecil B. DeMille and Charlton Heston? Great. Well, so what you know about Moses is that he comes from a background of privilege. He spent 40 years in the palace of Egypt. Just as we saw in the video, Moses was placed by a Hebrew woman into a little basket. He was found by a daughter of Pharaoh. And then what happened is the daughter of Pharaoh brought him into the palace, and he was raised as a son of Pharaoh. Well, what that meant is that he got all the privilege, all the perks, he got all the material wealth, all the wisdom, all the education, all the training. He had those stunning Charlton Heston good looks, and he had this amazing life. It was a life of privilege. Second thing you need to know about his background, though. Second thing is that he had a background of failure. He had a background of failure. The fact was, age 40, Moses gets a little bit ahead of God. And he decides that he finds out that he's a Hebrew. He sees an Egyptian beating on a Hebrew, and he goes and he kills the Egyptian. What's interesting about the story is this not only obviously makes the Egyptians mad, it makes the Hebrews mad because of the consequences of it. So what happens is there's a warrant put out for his arrest. So now the kid who was raised in the palace has a murder rap. And he has to run from the palace, so he's on the run. And where does he go? He goes out into the middle of the desert. If you look on the map there, he leaves Egypt, he goes out into the middle of the Sinai desert. He spends 40 years in the palace, 40 years in the desert. And for 40 years in the desert, his primary company is a bunch of sheep. Third thing about Moses, you need to know about privilege, you need to know about failure, you also need to know Moses was an overcomer. He was an overcomer. Not only did he overcome the reality of failure in his life, he overcame the reality of what was thrown against him, and he ends up accepting a mission to go as a shepherd from the desert back to the palace, speak to Pharaoh, and ask Pharaoh to let his people go. So imagine this. He starts out with a background of privilege. He thinks, I'm hot stuff. Then he has a background of failure, and he goes, I'm a loser, okay? And as a loser, he ends up saying, look, I've got nothing to live for, my life means nothing. But then the third phase of his life, he becomes an overcomer. He goes to the palace, he talks to Pharaoh, eventually God lets the people go, and he leads 2 million Israelites on a camping trip into the desert. That's an amazing story. You'll pick up more of that next week. And then finally, write this down, he had a background of self-doubt. He had a background of self-doubt. Moses literally did not believe in himself. He did not believe that he could do what God wanted him to do. He ended up just feeling like he couldn't do anything. He felt like he was a total nobody. Dwight L. Moody was a famous evangelist, and in the 1800s he was led to Christ and discipled by a shoe cobbler, and he said this about Moses. Moses spent 40 years in the palace thinking he was somebody. Then he spent 40 years in the desert learning he was a nobody. And the last 40 years of Moses' life, he learned what God can do with a nobody. That's a cool thing, and that's a good way to think about Moses' story. But in Moses' relationship with God, he was a guy who made excuses, and he said no to God repeatedly. And I'm on a crusade. I'm on a crusade to help people see Bible heroes as everyday folks. I think you're going to see yourself in Moses' story. I think you're going to hear yourself in Moses' excuses. I know I do. So I hope as we go along here, you'll see and hear these excuses, and you go, I have said the exact same thing. Take your teaching notes and write this down in number 1. Here's the first excuse. I'm not qualified. I'm not qualified. Have you ever said that to God? You felt like God wanted you to do something. You felt like you were being urged to take a next step. You were urged to take a risk. You were going to do something that was a little scary. You felt like God wanted you to do it. And what you said back to God was, I'm not qualified. Listen to Moses, Exodus 3, verse 11. By the way, we'll be in Exodus 3 and 4 all morning today, page 47 on the story. But Exodus 3:11, Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? I made a list. I could just hear Moses in his own mind saying something like this. Hey, I'm a nobody. I'm the wrong guy. You called the wrong bush. You know, Moses is out in the desert. He's walking around. He sees this bush. It's on fire. That wouldn't have been completely uncommon in the hot desert. What was amazing is that this bush was on fire and it wasn't burned up. And then he hears the voice of God in the bush. Now, if you spent 40 years of your life out in the desert with sheep as your primary company, you might be wondering at this point, I think I may be one sheep short of a flock. I mean, you would have just thought, maybe I have lost it. I've gone over the edge. I've missed it. You see a burning bush, no uncommon deal, but I see a burning bush that's not burned up. And then I hear the voice of God. And I could just hear him say, look, you got the wrong guy. He says, this is me. I'm Moses the murderer. There's no way you want me. I'm Moses the shepherd. That's not going to impress Pharaoh. And then he says, look, I've been rejected by both the Egyptians and the Hebrews. I can hear Moses saying right now, there's no way. I know who gets in the palace of Pharaoh. Remember, he'd been there the first 40 years. And so he says, I am not qualified. Now, can I ask you, have you ever felt that way? Ever felt like you were not qualified to do what God's asked you to do? I have felt that way. So let me give you an amazing answer. It will not help your self-image. Write this down. It's not about you. Okay? And I'm glad we had that little orange insert today, and I'm glad we got a counseling center, and that's absolutely critical. I totally believe in it. But I'm telling you, we live in a world that tells everybody, oh, you're awesome, it's awesome, here's a ribbon, here's a trophy. Well, I got to tell you this. In the Old Testament, when God's talking to Moses, and Moses said, I'm not qualified, God's answer to Moses is, you're not qualified. It's not about you, Moses. The story of Moses, the story of the upper story of what God's going to accomplish through the life of Moses is not, at the end of the day, about Moses. It's about God. Look what God tells him. I will be with you. This will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God in this mountain. Jesus himself in Matthew 28 says, surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. I love when Moses says to God, hey, I'm the wrong guy. You got the wrong bush. I could even hear Moses in his own mind saying, look, I'm no longer the prince in the palace, and I'm not even Charlton Heston. There's no way you want me for this part. You just can't do this. And God says, look, it's not about you. It is not about you. It's about me. The reality is if you feel like you're not qualified, if you feel like you can't do what God's asked you to do, who knows that better than God? But God's talking to you because he's got something for you. It's not about you. One of the object lessons of Moses' life is what God can do with everyday people like you and me. You know, if God just picked out superstars that he could work with, then all the rest of us would be off the hook. But God takes everyday, ordinary people and does extraordinary things with him with his power and his strength. Here's a second excuse. I don't know what to say. I just don't know what to say. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand for that one. I'll just raise my hand. I have gotten hundreds of phone calls, been in hundreds of conversations over the course of my life where the first, second, and third thought I had was, I don't know what to say. When you get that phone call that tells you about a family member or a loved one who's got a huge disease issue going on, when you know somebody's in the hospital, when you hear somebody that's experienced a tragedy, when you hear about somebody that's going through a really hard thing, and one of the reasons you feel like you want to avoid them, you know in your knower you should go towards them, but every fiber of your being is saying, no, I don't want to go near them, and the reason I don't want to go near them is because I don't know what to say. If you have ever been at that place in your life where you do not know what to say, you have a lot in common with Moses and a lot in common with me. Look at his story. In verse 13 it says, Moses said to God, suppose I go up to the Israelites and say, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what is his name? Then what should I tell them? Every single one of us have faced circumstances where we avoid the hospital room, we don't pick up the phone, we don't talk to the person in the next cube, we keep the conversation light, we don't go to the difficult place, we have no idea how to, we kind of avoid the friend in the hallway, and we do all that because we don't know what to say. What do I say to somebody who's going through horrible stuff? I don't know what to say. Man, if you're there, I totally relate to that, and I know that Moses went through the same thing. Look at God's answer to Moses. He starts in verse 14. He says, God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you're to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name which I am to be remembered from generation to generation. Go assemble the elders of Israel. Say to them, the Lord your God, the Lord of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me. I've watched over you and have seen what has done to you in Egypt. I've promised to bring you up out of your misery into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. I always want to say termites right there, but I just have to prevent myself from saying it. But now you know what was in my head. A land flowing with milk and honey. The elders will listen to you. Then you and the elders are to go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the desert to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. I'll stretch out my hand. I'll strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I'll perform among them. and after that, he'll let you go. This is a crack up. This is the last little part. It says, I'll make the Egyptians favorably disposed toward this people so that when you leave, you'll not go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbor and any woman living in her house for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, which you'll put on your sons and daughters, and so you will plunder the Egyptians. Now write this down. Point people to God. Point people to God. If you don't know what to say, if you don't have the words to say, instead of avoiding the person in pain, instead of not dealing with the person that you know is hurting, instead of sort of stepping away from them, go give them the gift of your presence. You don't have to have amazing wisdom. You don't have to have the right answer. You might not have any answers. I have stood with people. I have wept with people. I've been alongside people and I say, why has this happened? And my answer is, I don't know. But I hug them, I pray with them, I cry with them, I say, I don't know, but I know who does. So this whole thing with Boss happened with Sherwood Carthen. Man, I got the message about 10 minutes after it happened, got like 50 phone calls and texts, and I started praying. I prayed for Charlene right away. I prayed for the children, the grandchildren. I prayed for the church. And if you ask me, why did this happen? I don't know. I don't know why my friend is now walking the streets of heaven and celebrating. And if he ever did say amen by myself, he's not saying it anymore. He's not saying amen by himself. He is saying amen with a cloud of angels, with a hall of witnesses. But we who are left here, we're by ourselves. So we say, God, why has this happened? I don't have the answer to that. I don't know. But what I do know is that my Father knows. And I know that my Father is the one who brings comfort and hope and joy and peace. So if you don't know what to say, you're in really good company. All you got to do, though, is just say, look, I just want to press in with you. I want to be present with you in your pain. I don't have any answers to your pain, but I want to be with you. That is such an amazing gift that you can give a friend. If you will be present with them in their pain, that's awesome. Now, I got to focus you on the last little part of this because it's awesome. So you're the children of Israel. You're getting ready. You think God's going to deliver you. You've been in captivity over 400 years. And God promises Moses that when he finally gets finished with the children of Egypt, they're going to be so glad to let you go that he says to the women, okay, women, listen up. This is what I want you to do. We're going to be moving from here to there. They don't know where there is yet. We're going to go to there. But before we go from here to there, I want you to go to your neighbor, knock on the door and go, hey, we're getting out of Dodge. And before we do, I'd like to know if I could have all your jewelry. So you're a gal and you get that knock on your door and go, ain't no way that's going to happen. But what happens if you read the story is they end up getting all their jewelry. They get jewelry, they get clothing, and they embark on this huge camping trip. And literally the bottom line is they got tons of gold and silver and precious jewels on this trip to go with them. Unbelievable. That's the kind of God we have. If you don't know what to say, you just basically say, look, the reality is I'm going to point people towards God. I'm going to let people know that's where they can trust. Maybe that's an excuse you've used before like I have. I don't know what to say. Just point people to God. Here's the third excuse. See if you've ever used this one. They won't believe me. Have you ever wondered if God wanted you to share Christ with somebody else? But the reason you didn't share Christ with somebody else, the reason you didn't talk to that coworker, didn't talk to the neighbor, didn't talk to the annoying family member, is that you wondered if they would think you were a fool. You wondered if they would reject you. You wondered if they would just look at you and go, there's no way. Or maybe, just maybe, you had a little dream that came from God in your heart and it began to take root in your soul and you thought, man, I think God's talking to me. I think God's telling me what to do. But you didn't want to tell your friends because they make fun of you. You didn't dare to speak it out because, man, you didn't want to get criticized. Well, if you've ever said, they won't believe me, they'll think I'm a fool, you're in good company. Listen to Moses. Moses said, what if they don't believe me and listen to me? And what if they say the Lord didn't appear to you? Well, I want you to circle those words if you have a Bible. What if? What if? Now, we're friends. I've been here several times. Anybody in this room ever say, what if? Like I do all the time. I'm kind of an analytical person and I kind of sometimes worry and I know I got to give that to the Lord right away. I think I told you before, if you have children and your kids get to age 16, your prayer life will improve. They get their driver's license, you will automatically become a more consistent prayer. I have 5 kids, oldest one's girls, they're married out of the home. The 4th one is a boy. And just before he turned 17, he didn't get it right away at 16, but just before he turned 17, he got his driver's license. I assure you, every time he leaves our house driving that vehicle, I pray to Jesus that multiple angels will be released from your assignment and given to my son. I'm kidding. I don't make it that personal, but I do say, Lord, take whatever angels you've got that are excess and put them around my son's car. Just be with my son and watch over that. You know, your prayer life gets better when your kids are out of the house and a hunk of metal going down the street at a certain number of miles per hour, hopefully very safely and legally. But anyway, so this is what Moses did. He says, what if? Well, that kind of worry, you know that's not from God. You know that kind of fear is not from God. Perfect love casts out fear. You know that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind. So how do we handle this? Well, this is one of my favorite stories in the whole Bible. You got to be there, friends. We're in the middle of the desert. I've spent 40 years in the palace thinking I was somebody, 40 years in the desert learning I was nobody, and now I'm seeing a burning bush that's not burned up, and I'm hearing the voice of God, and I'm having a conversation. That's the setting. Are you there? So this is what happens. Moses answered, what if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, the Lord did not appear to you? Then the Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? And he says, a staff. So very quickly, object lesson. I'm holding this tightly. I'm not going to throw it down. I haven't lost it in 2 previous services. This is the staff of Moses, okay? Now, truthfully, this is a microphone. But really, I want you to think about this as a staff. And what that meant in the Bible was it was a stick. It's very technical. It was a stick, okay? You're walking through the desert, you're in the sand, you need a stick to walk with, okay? So God says to Moses, you have a stick in your hand, okay? Then this is what he says. He says, throw it on the ground. Now, I want to stop right here. We're all friends. Tell me the truth. If you're in the desert, you're seeing a bush that's on fire, but it's not being burned up, you hear the voice of God, you've become convinced that you're having a conversation with the Almighty, and he says to you, take the stick in your hand and throw it on the ground. How many of you are willing to throw your stick on the ground after the voice of God? Okay. About half of you. The rest of you, what in the heck will it take to get you to obey? I mean, does God have to appear in all his glory and smite you? That's biblical for nuke you? I mean, really. He said, take the stick and throw it down. Wouldn't we all be willing to do that, right? Okay. So, listen carefully. I think this is hilarious. The Lord said, throw it on the ground. Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. You know the Indiana Jones, Harrison Ford says snakes. Why did it have to be snakes? Well, I am the same kind of sissy lala around snakes. If there are snakes around me, I'm like, ah! My cousin in Maine, I didn't do this in the other 2 services. My cousin in Maine, he's the same way, and he's about my same age. And I was visiting him one time. I was a California boy, city boy. Closest thing we had to snakes was garden hoses that were on. Anyway, so we go to Maine. We're walking across the yard one day, and a little snake, probably just a little harmless garter snake, but a garter snake goes through the grass. We both jump, meet each other in midair. A bunch of sissies. Just couldn't help it. I hate snakes, not a fan. And if you're a herpetologist, God bless you. We have a healing program for that. That is a problem. So anyway, he throws the thing on the ground. It becomes a snake. Now, listen to this. Then the Lord said to him, reach out your hand and take it by the tail. All right. So, I've been in the desert for 40 years. I see a bush that's on fire and it's not burned up. I hear the voice of God. I'm having a conversation with God. He said, what's that in your hand? I say, it's a stick. He says, throw it down. I throw it down. It becomes a snake. Most of us in this room will go, yeah, I'll throw my stick down if God told me to. Now I want to ask you this. Once the stick has become a snake and it's wriggling on the ground, how many of you say, if I heard God tell me, I'd reach down and pull it by the tail? I celebrate your faith. I don't have it. I would not do it. If God himself told me to pick up the snakes, I'm just telling you that probably I would spend a long time going, that's not God. I didn't hear from God. God would never tell me that. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. I got a mind. That's a snake. I'm not going near it. And then you got to read the Bible carefully. And then especially says, pick up the snake from the tail. Now, I've watched all these National Geographic shows. I know you don't pick snakes up by the tail, right? If I ever was foolish enough to pick up a snake, and I won't be, I will pick it up from the head so it can't bite me, right? I will not pick it up from the snake because then it could come and bite me, right? Are we on track here? All right, I'll put this back so I don't drop it. All right, so reach out your hand. So Moses reached out, took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff. By the way, I'm hammering on Moses a little bit. I love that he reached out his hand, just like you faith-filled people. He reached out his hand, he picked up the snake, and turned back into a stick. This, the Lord said, so that you may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Then the Lord said, put your hand inside your cloak. So Moses put his hand inside his cloak. When he took it out, it was leprous, white as snow. Now put it back in your cloak, he said. So Moses put his hand back, and when he took it out, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. I want to tell you this today. You're not hearing this by accident. There's a reason God had you in this place. And I know nothing about your life. I don't know any details, but I know this. A lot of us have said this. A lot of us have said, I can't. A lot of us have said, I don't know what to say. A lot of us have gotten to the place of God where we've made an excuse before God. And we've made that excuse before God. We've gotten to the point where we just say, there's no way. In fact, if I do take a step, people won't believe me. They'll say I'm a fool. And I want you to hear this. God has something he wants you to do. I have no idea what it is. But he has something he wants you to do. And some of you have been living your whole life and you're on the edge of a precipice where you got to decide to go left or go right. And God's telling you to do something. I don't know what it is. But whatever God has told you to do, if you keep saying no to him, you will never experience the fullness of what he wants to do in your life. God wants you to say yes to him. And even Moses, who said no, 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 reached out and grabbed the snake, and it turned back into a stick. He reached his hand inside, turned into leprous, and then back in, it turned white. The one I didn't read to you is he takes a cup, fills it with water, it becomes blood. And then he pours it out, it becomes water again. Over and over again, God longs to show us. So write this down. Trust God for authority. Trust God for authority. There is nothing you have in this world that's worthy of other people believing in you. My friend Ephraim was speaking at Boss this morning. They don't need a word from Ephraim. They need a word from God. I've gotten some early reports from Boss based out of South Sac. What they're saying, the people are saying on staff are saying is that we're hearing God this morning. God is beginning the healing right now. It'll take a long time. There's sorrow. There's suffering. There's grieving. But God will bring healing. The reality is you don't need a word from me at all. What you need is a word from him. And if he tells you to share with somebody, if he tells you a dream he plants in your heart, and if you're worried that people won't believe you and you have that kind of fear, I'm telling you this. God is present, and he wants you to trust him for your authority. Write this down. Here's the fourth excuse. I don't do well. I don't do well. See, there's a difference between qualified, that's sort of our credentials, and then saying, I just don't do well. And maybe you're here today and go, like, I just can't sing. I can't write. I can't speak. I can't do whatever it is that God's asked me to do. There's one thing to say no to God because you don't think you have the qualifications. Lord, I don't even meet the minimum qualifications for that job. But it's another thing to say, God, even if you did put me in that job, I can't do it. I don't have the skills. I mean, I like to play ball. I like to play basketball. But, I wasn't good enough to make my senior year of high school basketball team. But I like to play ball. I got two boys now who are 6'3" and 6'2". I like to play ball. But when I'm playing against my two boys, I kind of remind myself, I'm not good enough. Because they're good. They play ball. Then I go see a pro game. And I remind myself, I'm really not good enough. These people are in a different parallel universe, and it's not the one I occupy. Now, if God told me tomorrow, hey, I want you to play pro ball, I could tell you about my lack of qualifications, but I could also tell you, I'm just not good enough. Even if I had the qualifications to get in, if they signed me, I'd take the money and run. But if they signed me, I'm not good enough. This is what Moses is saying to God. Have you ever said that? Have you ever said to God who asked you to do something, I can't. I'm not good enough. If you've ever said that, man, you got a lot in common with Moses. You got a lot in common with me. I'm not good enough. Moses said to the Lord, O Lord, I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you've spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. I mean, I can hear Moses say, please, God, don't ask me to say anything. I'll put a little bumper sticker on my chariot that says, whip your horse if you love Yahweh. Something like that. I could do that. But I am not going to talk for you, God. I am not good at this. Well, God ends up talking to Moses. And if you have children or grandchildren here, every once in a while they can push your button, right? Just every once in a while, a child or grandchild kind of push your button. They'll tell you why the room's not clean or the schoolwork's not done or they forgot to do this chore or, whatever happened. Well, this is what happens with God and Moses. Lord said to him, he's starting to get a little annoyed, says, who gave man his mouth? Who makes him deaf or mute? Who gives him sight or makes him blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak, and I will teach you what to say. Write this down. It's such a great encouragement. God will help you. Where God guides, he provides. If you are not qualified and if you are not capable, but God's calling you to do it, God will help you. He will help you. I'm going to read to you the end of the story. Moses said, "Oh Lord, please send someone else to do it." And I just crack up at Moses. I love him. Now, if you've been in the desert 40 years, you've seen a burning bush. A burning bush is not built up. You've heard the voice of God. The stick turned into a serpent. Your hand turned into leprous and then not. A cup of water turned into blood and then not. And God's telling you, go speak for me. I will help you. Is there a point in time in which you go, okay, well, this is all on you, man. You're the one who settled it. Is there a point in time where you just go, okay? Moses doesn't. Moses says, look, is there anybody else you could get to go? Because I'm not good at this. Well, then the Lord's anger burned against Moses. And he said, what about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He's already on his way to meet you, and his heart will be glad when he sees you. You'll speak to him, put words in his mouth. I'll help both of you speak, and I'll teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth and if you were God to him. But take this staff in your hand so you can perform miraculous signs with it. You remember that country song, Thank God for Unanswered Prayers? Had to do with relationships that didn't work out. Can I just tell you, we don't have time to unpack this today, but the prayer that Moses kept praying, not me, send somebody else. Did you know that when God answered Moses' prayer, that was the biggest problem of his life from that point forward? Be careful what you pray for. Make sure that you're praying in alignment with the will of God. And if God has told you to do something specifically, stop making excuses. Because when Moses finally did say yes to God, he had that amazing confrontation in front of Pharaoh. He led 2 million people out of Egypt. He went across the desert, parting the Red Sea. God ended up giving him the 10 Commandments. You're going to read in the days ahead amazing things about what God did through this man Moses, who was a reluctant biblical hero. He was a maker of excuses, somebody who said no to God time and time and time again, and he was just like you and me. So I want to ask you this question today. I'll just ask you, what have you been saying no to God about? What excuses have you been using? Because I want to tell you this, that when you say yes to God, incredible things happen. And if you keep saying no to God, not much good takes place in your life. God longs for us to say yes to him. Close your eyes for just a moment. Spirit of the living God, I know that you're in this place right now. And I know that in the worship and in the teaching that you've been moving. And God, I've said it verbally, I'll just say it again. I do not know a single detail about a soul in this room. But I thank you, Jesus, that you know every single detail about every soul in this room. I thank you that there are men and women, boys and girls, young men, young women, who you basically look at and you say, look, I know the story of your life, and I've been gently talking to you. I've been gently sort of knocking on your heart. I've been gently wooing you to me. And God, like Moses, I have lived a life of making mistakes and making excuses and saying, no, no, no. And God, I know what it's like to say no to you. And if that's the story of anybody in this room, maybe you've even just been knocking on their heart to come to know you. If this room has people in who've said no to you and have made excuses, would you just break through that right now? And God, thankfully, I also know what it's like to say yes to you. I know what it's like to say, God, I don't feel qualified. I don't know what to say. I'm worried about what will happen if people reject me. And I can't do it. But I also know what it is to say, but Lord, if this is you, then I'm going to say yes. And I'm going to lean in. And God, I thank you for the miracles that take place when we say yes to you. Lord, thank you for the upper story, how you're working out things in the world, and thank you for the lower story. That's the reality of where we live and breathe and have our being. I pray, God, that your story would be worked out in our story, that we would be known as a people who say yes to you. Amen.